Have you ever felt like you're just like wandering through this huge philosophical landscape, right? You're
Yeah.
like, where am I? What's going on? Well, today we're going deep into the work of John Norris,
Okay.
a 17th century English thinker who was grappling with some of the same big questions that we are even today.
Yeah.
But he was doing it right at this really interesting crossroads,
Mm-hmm.
between like Cartesian rationalism and then this sort of like rising tide of Lockean empiricism.
Yeah. If you're someone who wrestles with like what is the fundamental nature of reality and how do we come to know it, Norris gives us a really interesting like case study in navigating those early modern debates.
So in this deep dive, we're going to explore the key philosophical contributions of John Norris,
Right.
who lived from 1657 to 1711. And what's our mission?
Yeah.
To understand his unique position in this early modern period of philosophy,
Yeah.
especially his very ambitious attempts to really strengthen and bolster the arguments coming from the rationalists,
Okay.
and then also his critiques of emerging empiricist thought,
Yeah.
and especially looking at Descartes, Malebranche, and Locke.
Exactly. And our primary source for all this is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on John Norris.
Okay.
It's a really good resource. It sort of brings together his life, his main works, and all of his kind of philosophical ideas. So, good place to start.
Awesome. So let's just like unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
Who was John Norris? What's the stage that we're setting here?
Well, John Norris was born in 1657 and he died in 1711. And what's interesting is that he was really working to continue the Cartesian project in England
Okay.
right at the time when Locke's empiricism is becoming very popular.
Okay.
But he wasn't only a philosopher.
Okay.
He wrote on all sorts of things: politics, religion, ethics, and even poetry.
Wow. A real like intellectual of his time.
Yes. But philosophically speaking, he was really interested in completing the philosophical system of Nicholas Malebranche.
Right.
He felt that Malebranche hadn't really demonstrated or proved certain aspects of his view.
Like what, for example?
Well, mainly the existence and the character of something called the intelligible world, which we'll talk about more, but it's basically related to the mind of God.
Okay.
He was also concerned with proving the existence and the immortality of the soul, which, was a big debate at the time,
Huge, yeah.
especially with the rise of more kind of materialist philosophies.
Sure. And he was also concerned about the theological debates of his time, right?
Yeah, so the theological landscape was really important to Norris. He was worried about what he saw as heterodox views,
Okay.
particularly those held by the enthusiasts like the Quakers and the Socinians who challenged some central Christian doctrines.
So how did he philosophically engage with those? What were the sort of like tools that he used?
He developed something called ideal philosophy, and a key part of this was the idea of a divine light. But this wasn't like some mystical thing that the Quakers talked about.
Right.
It was more like the natural working of our intellect, which is grounded in God.
Okay, so before we dive into this whole divine light thing,
Right.
let's just like look at his education and early influences.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah, so he had a very good education, first at Winchester School,
Okay.
where he was good at Greek and Latin. Then he went to Exeter College in Oxford.
Okay.
Spending years reading these scholastic and ancient authors, these were the philosophers in the medieval period who were really influenced by Aristotle,
Yeah.
who Norris also drew on. And a key moment for him was his election as a fellow at All Souls College, also in Oxford.
Okay.
That was a huge moment for him.
Sure.
Gave him a lot of freedom to pursue his own interests.
Okay. And when did this whole Malebranche thing happen? When did he get into that?
Sometime before 1688, he encountered the writings of Malebranche, and it was a big moment for him. It changed a lot.
Okay.
Before that, in some of his earlier works, like A Collection of Miscellanies and The Root of Liberty, he was more independent in his thinking.
Okay.
But after Malebranche, his work aligns much more with that. He even corresponded with Henry More, one of the Cambridge Platonists, around that time, which was included in his book Theory and Regulation of Love, which really marks the first time he used Malebranchian arguments.
So it was more than just an influence. It's like he fully converted to Malebranche.
Yeah, very enthusiastic about it.
Wow.
Aside from his academic stuff, he was also rector in a couple of parishes.
Okay.
But it seems like he really preferred to be studying, reflecting, and writing.
Makes sense.
He also had this huge network of correspondence.
Okay.
Lots of notable intellectuals, people like Elizabeth Thomas, Damaris Cudworth, Lady Masham, Mary Estelle, and of course, John Locke.
That's a pretty vibrant intellectual community.
Yeah.
What about the debates he had with the Quakers and Socinians.
Hmm.
How did his philosophy play into that?
He addressed them pretty directly in his writings. He had a big back and forth with this Quaker named Richard Vickers, which resulted in his book, Two Treatises Concerning the Divine Light. And in that book, he was really trying to differentiate his own understanding of divine light as like the natural working of reason that comes from God, from the Quaker idea of like direct revelation.
Gotcha.
He also wrote a book called An Account of Reason and Faith, specifically to respond to the Socinians, who challenged the rationality of core Christian doctrines.
Okay, and Locke, it seems like that relationship went south, didn't it?
It really did. At first, they were kind of on the same page because they both wanted to push back against these Quaker claims of immediate enlightenment.
Okay.
But their philosophical differences were huge, and the relationship just fell apart after Locke suspected Norris of opening a letter that he was supposed to give to Lady Masham.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and despite Norris's denials, Locke just didn't trust him after that.
That's rough. That personal fallout also seems to have spilled over into their philosophical debates as well.
For sure. Soon after that, Locke publishes his remarks upon some of Mr. Norris's books, which was supposed to be a critique of Malebranche.
Right.
But a lot of people think it was actually aimed at Norris, who Locke saw as basically just repeating Malebranche.
Okay.
Now, Norris had already published his own critique of Locke's essay concerning human understanding called Cursory Reflections.
Okay.
So this was a big point of tension, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And then all this leads up to his most important work, right?
Right. After years of developing his ideas, he publishes the first volume of his magnum opus, an essay towards the theory of the ideal or intelligible world, in 1701,
Okay.
with the second volume coming out in 1704. These books represent his most complete and well-developed philosophical system.
So he doesn't stop writing after this huge work, right?
No, he keeps going. He explores the nature of the soul in more detail,
Okay.
in works like A Philosophical Discourse Concerning the Natural Immortality of the Soul,
Okay.
and A Letter to Mr. Dodwell Concerning the Immortality of the Soul of Man. And his final work, published right before his death in 1711, was a treatise concerning Christian prudence.
It's sort of weird that someone who was clearly a big deal in his time hasn't really stuck around in how we talk about the history of philosophy. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. One reason might be that his philosophical system is kind of a blend of a lot of different sources: Descartes, Malebranche, scholasticism.
Okay.
So he's not easy to categorize. He's often called the English Malebranche because he really liked Malebranche.
Okay.
He praised Malebranche's search after truth like crazy, and he thought Descartes had created the only truly intelligible frame of natural science.
Okay.
But he also used a lot of ideas from earlier thinkers like Aquinas and Suarez.
So maybe because he's bringing together so many different traditions, it makes him harder to pin down as like one specific thing, and that's why he's not as well known today.
Possibly. Intellectual history often focuses on clear lineages and distinct schools.
Right.
Norris, because he's drawing from so many places, might be harder to fit into that narrative.
Makes sense.
But for us, trying to really get these rationalist, empiricist debates, his work is super valuable.
Okay.
His arguments with Locke help us see what's really at stake for both sides.
Right.
Plus, he influenced some later figures like Mary Estelle and Arthur Collier, and his take on Malebranche's vision in God and occasionalism are important to see how Cartesian ideas developed in England.
Okay, so we've set the stage. We know who Norris is, what his background is.
Yeah.
So now let's get into his main ideas.
Okay.
Starting with God in the intelligible world
Yeah.
and how he tries to complete Malebranche's project.
All right. So Norris believed that Malebranche had started this whole thing, but he hadn't really proven the existence of this intelligible world,
Okay.
which Norris thought was basically the mind of God. It's this realm with eternal objects, kind of like Plato's forms,
Okay.
and these are the foundation of all knowledge. Norris even compares Malebranche to Galileo, like he's giving us the first glimpse of this new intellectual world.
I see.
And Norris sees his own theories, LNS state, as finishing what Malebranche began.
Okay, so what's the key thing that Norris adds?
Well, Norris really stresses that God is truth. He says that this intelligible world is nothing less than the mind of God.
Wow.
He even calls it intellectual America, this vast, unexplored territory.
That's a great image.
Yeah.
So how does he prove this intelligible world exists?
He gives us a bunch of arguments.
Okay, let's hear them.
His first one is the argument from creation. He says that since the created world is finite, It has to have gotten its existence from something else.
Okay.
That thing has to be infinite and necessary, and that's God.
Okay.
He also argues that God acts through thought, right?
Yeah.
But the world wasn't always there, so the ideas that God used to create the world must be eternal.
Okay.
And they must exist in this intelligible world.
I see.
He even calls it a fair, intelligible mirror reflecting the divine intellect.
So it's like God's mind is the blueprint for creation.
Exactly. His second argument is about natural kinds. Why are things the size and shape they are?
Okay, yeah.
Well, Norris says it's because they correspond to their idea in the divine intellect.
Okay.
And this is different from Malebranche, who didn't think God had specific ideas for every individual thing.
Interesting. So Norris is saying God has a much more detailed plan then.
Yeah. His third argument comes from perfect geometrical objects.
Okay.
Like, we can think of a perfect circle, but we never see one in the real world.
Right.
So Norris says that our very idea of a perfect circle means that a perfect circle must exist somewhere as its cause.
Okay.
Because something can't come from nothing, and it can't be more perfect than its cause.
That makes sense.
And since we have the idea of a perfect circle, it must have come from a perfect source.
So it's sort of a Platonic argument then.
Yeah, exactly. His fourth argument is about truth itself, and it's pretty clever.
All right, let's hear it.
So he takes the skeptic who says there is no absolute truth.
Okay.
And he points out that the skeptic is claiming that that statement is absolutely true.
That's a good point.
So there must be absolute truths out there.
Okay.
And since truth is about how ideas relate to each other, those truths have to be based in God's ideas.
I see.
He borrows from a philosopher named Suarez, who said that relations need a subject to exist in.
Oh, okay.
So eternal truths are real and independent, and they come from the simple essences of things.
Which are?
God's eternal ideas. So truth isn't just something we make up.
Right. That's a good argument against skepticism.
Yeah.
What's next?
His fifth argument is from things like metaphysics and geometry,
Okay.
what he calls the objective sciences. He says these fields deal with knowledge that's always true.
Yeah.
Like, it's true everywhere and always. So it can't be about the stuff we see in the world, which is always changing.
Right.
So those eternal truths that we find in those fields must be intelligible objects.
Which are?
Divine ideas in God's mind.
Okay, so the stuff we know for sure in logic and math points to a realm of ideas that are also for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His sixth and final argument is from God's existence itself. He's building on Plato here. Specifically, Plato's idea of exemplaria rerum and menta divina,
Okay.
which are the archetypes of things in God's mind.
Okay.
Norris says these are the original forms that God understands. So if God exists and if God has ideas, then this intelligible world of divine ideas must also exist.
Okay.
And he says these ideas aren't separate from God.
Okay.
They're really coessential with and indistinct from the essence of God.
So it's not like God is over here and the ideas are over there. It's all one thing.
Yeah. He says God knows himself perfectly in his own being,
Okay.
but he knows himself differently in relation to creation.
Gotcha.
So the intelligible world isn't outside God, it's part of him.
Yeah.
And Norris says that this intelligible world is actually easier to know than the natural world
Interesting. Why is that?
because it's necessary, eternal, unchanging.
Okay.
Our senses are just for survival, not really for knowing the truth.
Okay.
Real knowledge comes from thinking, specifically clear and distinct perception.
Gotcha. Okay, so Norris has this framework of God and the intelligible world. What about God's simplicity? How does that fit in?
Right. This was a big deal because Malebranche was accused of being a Spinozist.
Yeah.
Because critics said, if God has the idea of extension, then he must be extended himself, which is a problem for traditional theology.
Yeah, that would mean God has a body, which is a no-go.
Exactly. So Norris uses this distinction from scholasticism. Formal containment versus eminent containment.
Okay.
Formal containment is when the cause and the effect are made of the same kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
Eminent containment is when the cause contains the effect in a more perfect way, but they're not made of the same stuff.
Okay, I'm following.
So he uses the example of an architect's blueprint.
Okay.
The blueprint contains the design of the building, but it's not made of bricks and mortar.
Right.
So Norris says God contains the idea of extension, but not formally.
So God isn't made of extension, but he has the idea of it.
Right, as a perfect idea. So God is still immaterial and simple.
Okay, so that solves that problem. How does he then argue that God's attributes are all one thing?
He talks about divine ideality the fact that these divine ideas exist.
Okay.
And he says this is a consequence of God's infinite nature.
Okay.
And then he goes the other way and says that God's infinitude comes from the existence of these perfect infinite ideas.
Okay. But isn't that circular?
He avoids that by using the scholastic distinction between real and formal identity.
Okay.
So he uses Suarez again, and this distinction between esse formale, which is like how we conceive of something, and esse reale, which is its actual being.
Okay.
He says divine ideas are really identical to God's essence, so they're really infinite,
Okay.
even though we might think of them as limited in some ways.
So the different attributes we give to God are just different ways of understanding the same God.
Yeah. He even uses the existence of truth, which he also sees as an attribute of God, to prove God exists.
Okay.
He says all of God's attributes are really the same as each other because they're all identical to God.
Sure.
The different attributes are just how we, as finite beings, try to understand this infinite God.
Okay.
He compares it to one person who can be a parent, a teacher, a friend.
Okay.
They're all different roles, but it's still the same person.
That makes sense. So how does all this fit with his ideas about eternal truths and his critique of Descartes?
Right. He wants to show that God is simple. So he says that eternal truths are just relations between divine ideas.
Okay.
And then he reduces those ideas to God's essence. So everything goes back to this one God.
Gotcha.
As for Descartes, he disagrees with the idea that God just decided what eternal truths would be.
Okay.
He says there's a difference between God as intelligible, like the realm of ideas,
Okay.
and God as intelligent, like the one who thinks those ideas.
Okay.
He says Descartes is wrong to say that God's will determines eternal truths.
Okay.
Instead, those truths...
The attributes are the same. Why does divine ideality seem so important to him?
It's a good question. Even though he says the attributes are identical, he does put a lot of emphasis on divine ideality.
Okay.
He probably sees it as a fundamental part of God's essence, even if we understand it in a particular way.
Makes sense.
He does admit that we can't fully know God's essence.
Okay.
It's like Aquinas said, our understanding of God is different from how we understand things in the world.
Gotcha.
But he still thinks we know enough about God to accept Descartes' real distinction argument and to refute Locke's idea of thinking matter.
Okay, so that brings us to human knowledge and creation. How does Norris see that working?
This is where the differences between rationalists and empiricists become super clear.
Okay.
Norris is definitely a rationalist.
Okay.
He believes that everything we think about ultimately is God.
Okay.
And our minds are designed to know the truth.
So even when we're thinking about, like, our grocery list, we're somehow thinking about God.
In a way, yes. He uses this Cartesian framework for understanding thought. There's formal thought, which is the act of thinking itself.
Yeah.
And then there's objective thought, which is what we're thinking about.
Okay.
He follows Malebranche here and says that the ultimate object of all thought is God.
So we always end up at God, no matter what we're thinking about.
Yeah. And the variety of things we perceive and think about comes from the diversity of this ideal object,
Okay.
which is God's infinitely rich essence.
So all knowledge is about knowing God in some way.
Yeah. When we have ideas, either from our senses or our intellect, we're getting God's nature
Okay.
as it's reflected in creation.
I see.
Even our thoughts, our propositions, get their meaning and truth from ideal propositions, the relationships between divine ideas.
Okay. Did Norris make any distinctions between different ways of thinking?
He did. He talked about direct thinking, which is our everyday thinking,
Okay.
and then reflexive thought, where the mind looks at itself and its own contents.
Okay.
For Norris, this reflexive thought is like a deeper perception of the divine ideas. It lets us contemplate eternal truths. He knew about Locke's idea that knowledge is about seeing how ideas agree or disagree.
Okay.
But for Norris, the highest kind of knowledge is knowing those eternal truths directly.
Gotcha.
And the goal of our thinking should be to match our thoughts to those eternal truths.
That makes sense. And all this is related to Malebranche's vision in God, right?
Absolutely. Norris was totally on board with Malebranche's theory that all perception is about seeing ideas in God.
Okay.
He uses Malebranche's arguments against the idea that we perceive objects directly,
Right.
or that our minds create their own ideas.
Gotcha.
Instead, we see divine ideas in God's mind. But Norris tries to give a more detailed account of abstract thought.
Okay.
He explains how we can understand the essences of things by paying attention to those divine ideas.
Okay, so how does abstraction work in all this?
It's central. Norris defines abstraction as The considering one thing without another, not absolutely, but in things that are not really one without the other, nor yet really deniable one of the other.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, basically it's about focusing on one aspect of something.
Okay.
He calls it drawing away of a thing from itself.
Okay.
So it's not just thinking about two completely different things. Abstraction makes our thinking clearer, like glasses for our intellect.
I like that analogy. He talks about modal abstraction, right?
Yeah, like thinking about the shape or size of a body without thinking about the body itself.
Okay.
These modes, like shape and size, can't exist on their own.
Right. They need a body to be the shape or size of.
Exactly. And because our thoughts reflect God's ideas, modal abstraction helps us see what's really distinct and what's just a mode.
Okay.
If we can't separate two things in our minds, they're probably not really distinct.
Gotcha. So this abstraction is key to his arguments against Locke's thinking matter.
Right. Let's get into the big debate between Descartes' real distinction and Locke's thinking matter.
Right.
This was a huge issue back then.
Yeah.
Descartes said mind and body are totally different. Locke said maybe matter can think, with God's help.
Okay.
Norris saw this as a big threat to Descartes' system and spent a lot of time defending real distinction.
Okay. What was his main argument against thinking matter?
He basically used Descartes' argument, we can imagine the mind without the body,
Okay.
and we can imagine the body without the mind.
Right.
So they must be really distinct, not just different aspects of the same thing.
So if I can picture my mind existing without my body, then they must be different things.
That's the idea. He also didn't like Locke's idea that we get ideas from experience and reflection.
Okay.
He asked, what are these ideas, really? They have to be either mental things or modifications of mental things.
Okay.
And that didn't fit with his own system.
Right.
He said, the real object of our understanding is the divine ideas, the omniform essence of God.
Okay.
That's a much better explanation for how we know things.
So what about the idea of thinking matter itself? How did he argue against that?
He just didn't see how matter could think. Like, how can something that's just physical suddenly have consciousness?
Yeah, that's hard to imagine.
He even mentions Mary Estelle, who was confused about Locke saying God could make a triangle talk or dance.
Okay.
The point is, things are what they are because of their essence.
Right.
And those essences come from God's ideas.
Okay.
Bodies are extended, that's their essence. They don't have anything to do with thinking.
Gotcha.
He also argued that if thinking and extension were the same thing, then creating one would always mean creating the other.
Okay.
But we see thinking things that aren't extended like spirits or angels,
Okay.
so they must be different. The debate between Norris and Locke comes down to what ideas really are.
Okay.
Locke said they're mental representations, and being sure about them doesn't mean they're true.
Okay.
Norris said they correspond to God's ideas, so if we're clear and distinct about them, they must be true.
That's a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
So Norris's defense of real distinction relies heavily on his ideas about abstraction.
Yeah, but there's also a bit of a problem in his own system.
What's that?
He and Malebranche both said we can't know God's idea of the mind directly.
Okay.
We only know our own minds through introspection.
Right.
But his argument for real distinction needs us to know the essence of the soul.
Okay.
So it seems like there's a bit of a contradiction there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Even so, he also argues for the soul's immortality in other places.
Okay.
He says the soul is indivisible because it's immaterial,
Okay.
and it can't be destroyed because God keeps creating it.
Gotcha. And what about animals? Where do they fit in?
He mostly agrees with Descartes and Malebranche that they might be like machines,
Okay.
but he says we can't be sure, and we shouldn't be cruel to them, just in case they do have souls.
That's fair.
Okay.
Okay, we've talked a lot about his big ideas. Let's touch on his religious, practical, and political views.
Okay.
How do those relate to everything else?
Norris was a serious Christian, and his philosophy is deeply connected to his faith. He talks a lot about how important solitude and meditation are for getting closer to God.
Okay.
He sees the Christian life as about opening your mind to God's truth.
And love was important to him too, right?
Yes. In his book, The Theory and Regulation of Love, he compares love to the soul's movement towards God.
Okay.
He says God is the true object of all love,
Okay.
and he distinguishes between good love, which wants what's best for others,
Right.
and selfish love, which is based on desire.
Right.
Since he believes in occasionalism, he says our love should ultimately be directed to God.
Makes sense. He was also pretty critical of other religious groups, wasn't he?
He was. He really disliked the Socinians.
Okay.
He said they were on a slippery slope to atheism because they reject doctrines they don't understand.
Okay.
like the Trinity. He said that some truths are beyond our understanding, but that doesn't mean they're false.
Right.
And just because we don't understand something doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah.
He was also critical of the Quakers. He said their inner light wasn't a special revelation.
Yeah.
It was just their natural understanding.
Okay.
He even accused them of splitting from the church, which he saw as disobeying God.
Interesting. What about his political views?
He was a royalist, but he wasn't really involved in politics.
Okay.
He seemed to prefer stability and order based on his writings,
Okay.
like his poem A Myrnival of Knaves.
Okay.
But his main focus was always on serving God and being a good person,
Okay.
as we see in books like A Practical Treatise Concerning Humility
Okay.
and the distinction between high church and low church.
So to sum up, what are the biggest things we should take away from John Norris?
Well, he was a very ambitious philosopher,
Okay.
trying to create a complete system that brought together Descartes, Malebranche, and scholasticism.
Okay.
He had really unique arguments for this intelligible world and for eternal truths,
Right.
and he really engaged with Locke's empiricism.
Yeah.
His work shows us the tension between rationalism and empiricism in the early modern period.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's the big takeaway, the aha moment for us today?
I think the most interesting thing is seeing how he navigated all these big intellectual debates
Yeah.
he was dealing with.